we've talked about this on this program in the sense that the trans panic and CRT panic, where I'm in Virginia, work like gangbusters to convert a lot of suburban parents who otherwise vote Democrat. And I've shared on this podcast before, I know some of these folks, and they're like, they're going to make my kids trans. They're going to make my kids gay, right? And when you look at transgender people in America, it's less than 1% of the population. In fact, whenever I ask folks, when was the last time you encountered a trans person? They never have an answer. Like, when was the last time you were in the bathroom and a trans person came and said boo? And I want to ask you, and this is just you know this better than I do, but me just being an observer, why is this particular issue so successful in otherwise galvanizing the fears of otherwise logical, rational people?
Sure. I mean, it kind of plays on a lot of the old, tropes of uh, whether it's anti-gay tropes, anti-black tropes, like these things they take all of the old moral panics and then they just reuse the same strategies. Oh, we can't let trans people use the restroom because what if they go and they attack a woman or a little girl? And it's like that's the same sort of that's the same sort of panic that was brought up to try to argue against gay people and was argued, back in the 50s and whatnot, when it came to like segregated restrooms, these sorts of things, they go through time and the same panics get brought up over and over and over, and it's successful. The reason that I think that it's so effective is, like you said, when you ask people, when was the last time you interacted with a trans person? When was the last time you saw a trans person? They probably don't have an answer because trans people are a very, very small portion of the population. And it's fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with being a small portion of a population, which some people will then point to and go, see, that's why we shouldn't accommodate them. But that's kind of ridiculous in its own right. I mean, you wouldn't go, well, there aren't too many redheads out there, but so we're going to just ban them from restrooms or whatever. But the reason that I think that it works is that most of what people know about trans people is based on how trans people are portrayed in media. And that's part of why I'm so interested in media and news and how information travels and sticks. Like that is kind of my obsession. Like, why do people believe the totally bonkers off the wall things they believe? Why do people believe that there was a child sex trade dungeon or whatever in the basement of Comet Pizza? These things are rational beliefs, but they just kind of like fit in people's minds. They see that and they cling to it and they go, yes, that helps me understand the world a little better. And so it's easy to not understand trans people when you are not seeing trans people actually on TV. When the news covers trans people and talks about trans people, it is almost always done without any trans people there. And when media outlets write about trans people or trans issues, they often don't have trans people involved in that because they think that trans people would be biased, which, I mean, there's no, obviously people bring their own biases with them. But the fact that trans people are more or less kind of iced out of this makes it really difficult to counter the narratives that get pushed. The idea that it's like, oh no, they want to go and they want to turn your kid trans and they want to turn your kid gay and they want to do this. And just over the weekend there was Pamela Paul in the New York Times, one of the columnists there. She wrote that she basically, it was the same story that has been written time and time again about where it's like, well, when I was a little girl, I liked playing with trucks and baseball. And so I think about that and I go, oh no, if that was me today, would they try to tell me that I'm actually a boy? Or, oh, a boy likes playing with dolls. That doesn't mean he's actually a girl. And the answer to that is like, obviously it's like, yeah, correct. You're right. That is not what anyone is arguing. No one is like, oh God, he touched a doll. I guess we better go put him on estrogen. Like that's just not how anything works. But it's the narrative that gets out there. The same thing with, people like to talk about, people like to go, oh, so if so someone's a bigot if they won't sleep with a trans woman. It's like, what are you talking about? Where is this coming from? And it'll always be like some weird YouTube channel, where it's like some random person has one opinion, where they're just like, hey, dating is difficult for me and I wish that it was easier. And then people translate that to, oh, so if you don't want to date a trans person, that means you're a bigot. And it's like, no, not that's not really what anyone is saying. But it's so frustrating because we have those conversations. We have the conversations about whether it's okay to misgender and dead name people and call them their old names. Uh, but we don't talk about, hey, should trans people have legal protections in the workplace or in public accommodations or any of these other areas where literally everyone else has protections under the law. Like those are the things that when people are actually thinking about what trans people want, the trans movement's gone too far. It's like, how has it gone too far if the very first things on the list of things that trans people want, you know, legal protection, um, it haven't even hit those goals. So too far is the bare minimum. So it's really frustrating to see that work and to see this total wall of ignorance that's kind of put up by mainstream outlets that just want to feed the narrative and not necessarily push back on it.
I think a part of this, and a part of how conspiracy theories and how both sidesism happens is because of a lack of education and a lack of resources and a lack of, let's just be honest, the desire to know any better, right? I can remember working on the Hill probably, I think it was like the 110th Congress. So this is like a while ago. And when I got there, one of the pieces of legislation that was going around was the Equality Act. And it's like the Equality Act is always the act that is going around. And at the time, I am a Black queer woman who is working for a Black congresswoman and sitting on this committee as a staffer. And we're debating whether or not to leave transgender people behind so that we could just advance a piece of legislation with the the G and the B. And, as somebody who has been actively an LGBTQ advocate, worked on the front lines of marriage equality, has always had a foothold in some type of way, I have watched Parker both inside of the community as well as outside of the community be totally fine with saying, we'll come back for you later. Right. And, and the reality is that if inclusion is not made present, if education is not on the forefront, then there is no coming back later. Because the narrative is already taken off and the lie is around the corner before the truth even gets out the door. And bills are being advanced. And then what you have stated essentially by, saying, oh, well, I'm going to make this concession. People aren't concessions to be made. And I think that's also part of the problem here is that the right, in part, has been able to advance such lies because, in my personal opinion, the LGBTQ movement in and of itself is still also reconciling with their internal discrimination and adverse treatment of trans people. Because when I was in the beginning, it was like, can't you just assimilate? Right? Can't we, don't we all just want marriage? And if we get marriage, doesn't that mean that we're all okay? Right? And so I want to get your thoughts on, the internal inside LGBTQ movement treatment of the trans community and how, in fact, some of that is then mirrored and then taken to the extreme by the far right and what you have seen in similarities and or differences.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
Juicy
Yes,
conversation.
It, it is because what you were saying there is totally correct. About how there are these intra community sort of debates that happen. I mean, one of the first places that I ever wrote, where I was writing and actually getting paid for it, was at the Advocate, which is like
Mm-hmm.
an LGBTQ news outlet. And I was just doing quick news write-ups. I was doing like three quick blogs a day, that were just like, here's some story, write about it, put it out there. And every single time the comments on stories that had to do with trans people, and these would be
Yep.
stories that would be like a trans woman being like murdered or
Murdered.
assaulted
Mm.
or something like that. And just trying to write it up in a respectful way, because one of the reasons that I wanted to do that job was that at the time, I mean, and this was like 2012, so about 10 years ago, so
Mhm,
it's not that
mhm.
long ago. um, there were a lot of articles that, a for instance, I remember there was one where it was a trans woman was murdered and her body was found in, I think, like a lake or a pond or something like that. And the way that like the local news outlet described it, they said a strangely dressed man. And it's one of those things where I wanted to be able to write about it, to actually frame it in a way it's a bit more humanizing.
Humanizing?
Yeah,
I'm like,
stuff
what's
like
that
that.
word that begins with
Yeah.
an H? Yeah.
And it would always be so frustrating because the responses would be like, "Oh, here we go. We got to care about this other thing now." And it's like, I mean, the whole, the people who hate trans people also hate gay people and lesbians and bisexual people. They just think that trans people are the easier target right now.
Mm.
Yep.
And I think that there's this, I understand that there is some feeling among some LGBT folks who will go, well, if we just got rid of trans people, that would
Mhm.
be, everything would be so much easier
Fine.
for us.
Mhm.
But that's not necessarily true. I mean, these attacks on trans people in conservative media and Republican legislatures, they've gone on, and mostly haven't been noticed. I mean, these have been pretty consistent for the past several years, and it wasn't until they had this sort of success that they went out and they were like, huh, well, maybe we can try to kind of open it back up. Because remember, for a while, it seemed like it was like, oh, the homophobia of Republicans was maybe fading a little bit. And then it comes back. You have, suddenly they're like, yeah, we have to stop people from teaching kids about gay people existing. You had Ron DeSantis doing his thing and Greg Abbott and all of those guys. And so it really just shows that underneath the hate for trans people is a hatred of anyone who is different. And, that can go off in so many different ways. But it's really frustrating because, I mean, in 2007, at the time, what is now the Equality Act was the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. It
Mhm.
was that was the bill that kept failing as it would go through Congress.
Mhm.
And I remember in 2007, you had Barney Frank, who is
Yep.
openly gay. He was arguing that trans people should be taken out of it.
Taken out of the bill.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was on the Hill. Yes,
Yeah.
I remember.
What year was that? You said
was like
2007?
Yeah, that was
2007.
That was 2007. And the sad thing is the one congressman who like really was like loudly pushing back on this and making a great case for why this was a bad idea to cut trans people out was Anthony Weiner. Who, it's like,
You
like you
guys
watch
can't
his
win.
speech.
You all
Yeah.
can't win.
No, I know. It's like, oh, cool. Who's supporting us? Oh, cool. Great. First off, that's an unfortunate name for the particular concern that people have right now. Also, scandal coming, like
Yeah.
those sorts of things, like they add up. And, it's frustrating because he was right. He was right. You can't cut people out and then go, we'll come back for you, because on a state level, that's been done several times before. That's what New York did. And it was only I don't know, was it a few years back that trans people finally got legal protection at the state level in New York. And it was early 2000s when gay people had those protections. And the whole thing was, we have to cut trans people out. Otherwise, it'll be hard to do it. But once you have it where it's, try to pass a bill that only helps trans people,